Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone who's joining us live here via Zoom. It is January 26th, 8:30 Eastern time. If you're here live, if you're watching this on recording, welcome. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. My name is Jake Tuber, and I am the CEO and a coach at Endeavor Run. And I am super excited today because we have one of my new favorite people ever already. Leyla, we've known each other for what? How long? A couple months now?
Yeah, 2 months. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, she's already in the pantheon as far as I'm concerned. So I'm excited. Everyone who's joining live today will understand why. She's not in Australia. She's in North Carolina at the moment. Don't let her accent fool you. But she is from Australia originally. She is the director of training for our good friends over at 80/20 Endurance. And in the short time that I've gotten to know Leyla, she has continuously impressed me with her intellect, her creativity and thoughtfulness, and her willingness to put up with a lot of bad dad jokes. So she's a winner. I'm excited to introduce her to you. Leyla, welcome. Thanks for joining us for our chat today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited. Happy to be here.
Right on. So I think everyone's really excited to hear the answer to the big question, which is what can runners learn from triathletes? Spoiler alert, nothing really. Thanks for coming tonight, everyone. It's good to see you. This has been sponsored by our friends at Athletic Brewing. Excited to get there. No, we're gonna dive in right now. Let me start this off, and just to set the scene, I'm gonna ask Leyla a couple of questions that a few folks sent in early, and I would encourage you to paste comments if you're here live with us right now in the chat. Additional follow-up questions, I'll keep an eye on that as well. We certainly can open the phone lines later if anyone needs to get in some over the air. But feel free to turn your cameras on, and don't worry about your background. Don't worry about the kids screaming or how messy the house is or what you look like. As I like to say, they can't look worse than us. So it's all uphill. Leyla, let me ask you the main question I have for you. Imagine you're at a bar and you're chatting with somebody who's a big, serious runner, and they find out that you're a serious, successful triathlete, and they roll their eyes. And you're like, no, you know what? I am going to turn this person's idea about triathlon around. In fact, they're going to realize that there's a lot they should be taking from us triathletes to make themselves better as runners, if not be a little tri-curious. So how do you dive in? What are the one or two things you tell that person that's really going to get their attention, that are going to convince them that they should hear a little bit more about what triathletes have to say?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you that happens because I do think triathletes have a little bit of a bad reputation in the running world. I'm not, maybe some of the runners can explain that to me, but I can also, I've been to enough triathlons to know that some triathletes don't have the best of behavior. But yeah, I guess the biggest thing is triathlon is at the end of the day, it's a multi-sport event. It's one great big endurance event, but it's got three components to it. And through the journey of those three components, like learning how to be really fit and get relatively average at three different skills, it allows you to explore yourself as an athlete a little bit more completely. And I know that sort of maybe people are like, what? But you get to see yourself as a complete athlete, and you get to explore your fitness in different ways. So I always tell people that haven't tried a triathlon, or at least if they've got a little bit of curiosity on it, is if they're a really good runner, I'd always like to see how they'd fare in a triathlon. That's my first thing. So to not discredit how tough it is, I think, going across three sports is tough. So I'd lay that out on the bar, like, okay, let's start the challenge of who's fitter. That's always a fun way to get some conversation going. And then from there, it's just sort of understanding, I think, why some people end up doing, or triathlon is a better fit for them. So a lot of people can run for years. But I would say the majority of us, especially as we age, or just in general, the amount of time you can give towards running, having some variety in there through other sports is actually really helpful for your running. So That's normally where I'll lay it out there to get the curiosity driven.
So let me put my obnoxious runner head on, which is not a huge stretch necessarily, but let me really lean into it. How's that? And I'll play the guy at the bar with my non-alcoholic beer. Thanks, Athletic Brewing. It's going to be a big sponsor at our upcoming.
Got my green tea.
Touche. And I say, all right, listen, I'm not going to debate you that in general, a triathlete is more fit than a runner. The same way that most, milers aren't going to claim they're more fit than a decathlete. I get it. You need arm strength. You need different kinds of endurance. Even us runners have tried to run right after getting off the bike, and it's really, really hard to lift your quads. So I'm not suggesting that you're not fitter, you're not stronger, et cetera. But I do those things, running, maybe swimming. Running is where I'm at. Cycling, in the pool, that is cross training. That is to get out there and pound the pavement, because when I run, I want to put it all out there running. And frankly, a lot of that time on the bike, I mean, aren't you triathletes spending like 4 hours a day just at a slow pace on an indoor bike? How do you sustain that? Running is at least fun. Is that fun? I mean, what makes that enjoyable for you? How would you come back from a comment like that?
I think it just depends, it's really being present in the moment with moving your body. So yeah, I mean, some people, I would say runners love running, and that's absolutely a given. But I think being able to cross train and being able to apply a sense of presence, or finding enjoyment, or finding mastery through a different skill, I think you can find enjoyment there. And I think that's what happens with triathletes is you've got variety. And that's the number one thing I think that happens to most runners is they start to get burnt out. They start to go, the motivation can start to sort of drop down a little bit. It's very repetitive. There's a lot more room for injury. Now, not to say that triathletes don't get injured, because triathletes get injured, but there is a lot more room for injury, I think, in running. So having a cross-training approach, or at least having some variety and being able to say, you know what, I think I'm going to go do a swim today, or I think I'm going to bike today because the body is feeling possibly not recovered from a hard run, or there's some niggles that the run is irritating. There's nothing better as a triathlete than being able to be flexible and still be able to work out, because one, most of us train, yes, because we have performance goals, but we also, it makes us feel good. So if you only have one sport to call on, and you get an issue with that one sport where you can't run, if you don't have something up your sleeve, or a multi-sport focus, where you could swim or bike, usually biking or elliptical or some form of cross training, yeah, I think that's where a lot of runners get in trouble, and that can get you frustrated, angry, and really throw off your consistency. So I do think that triathletes are lucky in some ways that when we have something go wrong in one part, we have two others that we can go and focus on to not go crazy while we're recovering from a niggle or injury.
So if I was being charitable then, and when it comes to triathletes, again, I don't want to be, but if I were to be charitable, I would say that it sounds like you're suggesting by having an innate focus that is inherently multi-sport, the idea that you can't do one thing is less disruptive to exercise and sport being a part of your overall health and mental state. If you can't run because your innate sort of like starting principle position is, I'm a biker and a swimmer and a runner, I'm all things. If I can't run, it's less of a threat to my sense of self, to my identity, to my mental health, to my physical fitness in the near, potentially long term, because of those pivots. And so when you're training folks as runners, are you actually telling them, you know what, you should train as a triathlete, you should become a triathlete and then go run races? Or are you just saying you should build in some cross training for your running? Like, are you trying to bring folks over to the dark side of triathlon? Or are you just trying to build in some of the elements that, probably keep folks a little bit more injury free, or maybe keep folks to your position? And I see Mark in the chat has kind of echoed that, to keep folks in a position where they're a little bit more likely to have a sustainable practice as an individual amateur athlete.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the latter there, where it's, I don't, for myself, I try not to talk anyone into anything. And in fact, as a coach, often I talk people out of stuff more than I talk them into it, because people come to me highly motivated, and they have big goals and they want to do a lot of stuff. And often I help them navigate that around the reality of their life and, you know, how much time they have to commit and, you know, there are other goals throughout the year. But definitely with the majority of my athletes, even if they're doing a running focused block, so they may be like, you know, I just want to do a marathon or I just want to run a half marathon, and we will take time to focus on a single sport, and I think that's really healthy for triathletes too. But we always have an element of cross training in there, what you would consider cross training, and we use it as a way to prevent those overload issues or that repetition that can come. Now, there are some athletes out there that a lot of us follow and watch, and the best of the best, who can handle massive, big weekly volumes of running and they don't break down. But if we're all kind of honest, most of us, you know, majority of people doing this recreationally or even sort of elite runners, average to elite runners, the high volume can just really start to bring wear and tear, and you lose enjoyment if you keep having breakdowns. So having something up your sleeve to maintain, so where you would normally have maybe a recovery run, you can go do an easy swim or an easy bike replacement. It's less stressful on the body, but it's still working that wonderful cardiovascular fitness. You're still getting the recovery component, but you're resting the muscles, the tendons from that very corrosive running. So running is more impactful. It's a little bit more stressful on the body. And that, I think that's the tricky part of it, is knowing when to do that and being okay with it. So if you, from the beginning, you have a multi-sport kind of focus to your training, you kind of know, and you're more flexible. I also think, you know, and it's not even a multi-sport, but I think a lot of runners need to vary their terrain more. So they run too much on the same route at the same pace, you know, over and over again. And that also is repetitive to the body, repetitive to the mind. So don't be afraid to go run on the dirt, run on some trails, you know, vary it up, because I think all of it is really building your durability. All of it is building your fitness. But the whole point of it is to avoid those breakdowns that can come. So I do think that athletes from a triathlon background do have a slight advantage on being flexible on how to possibly replace one of their sports that's causing possible repetitive injury. Or mentally, I have a lot of people also just get burnt out and they need a break. So you know, I hate to always use myself as an example, but I reached a point and it took 8 years to be honest, but where I just was like, I do not want to ride my bike. I just wasn't enjoying it. It doesn't feel enjoyable. Winter comes, you're on the trainer. I was like, oh, I can't do Tour de Zwift one more time. I'm going to die. So I decided to do a run focus block. Now I'm still spinning twice a week, but I put that little bit of effort that I'd normally put in my bike training, I shifted it over to do some running. So I did the opposite. But I think runners could also do the same thing, is having, you know, that time to be able to go and do something else or run in a different way. It can really give you some great breakthroughs because you build your fitness without, you know, causing repetition that can cause injuries. But I also just think, and maybe runners would disagree with me, and I'd love to hear that, but at some point everything gets boring, right? Like repetition has a point at which you're like, ugh, just not doing it for me anymore. And normally that's when you'll go look for a different goal, a different type of race, or you'll put a race on the schedule. But I do think that if you're feeling at certain times of your season where that's happening, then, you know, don't be afraid to jump on the bike. A lot of people have Pelotons now. You know, swimming I know is difficult for people because not that's such a skill-based sport, but
that's the quick comeback here, right? If I'm the runner at the bar, it's all right, Jeff Bezos, go jump in one of your pools. I mean, who has the time and money to go train in their own pool all year, Leyla? Like, here's the follow-up question to that. This is an honest question.
Yeah.
My perception of triathletes in general is that the nature of the sport is, 2/3 of it is cross training, right? In a sense, because you're not on your feet, you're taking it easy on your tendons and joints in a way that allows you to get in more time. That's really beneficial if you're talking about hours at a certain heart rate threshold. That'll build your cardiovascular capacity. You could do certain exercises, those things to build VO2 max. Do you as a triathlete do other forms of what's cross training for a triathlete? If biking, I mean, are you on the elliptical? Are you on a slide board? Are you out there cross country skiing? I mean, what do you tell me more about what you do? Do you vary it up beyond bike, swim, run?
Yeah, so definitely strength training is pretty important for me now. So definitely 2 functional strength training sessions per week. So that's not cross training per se, but a very important aspect of that I focus on, particularly in the off season. But mountain biking, definitely trail running for me. So my first few years as a triathlete, I was very purist. Everything was road based, and then I started to get breakdown injuries, frustration, and was very lucky moving here to North Carolina and just all the beautiful trails. I was like, oh, I'll go and see what this is about. And my durability and my ability to actually train without feeling as broken down just was phenomenal. I was like, oh, the trail is like somewhere I need to go like more often. So I use it carefully. Obviously not once you're getting into a specific preparation, but even I'll be honest, I will throw the trail in for easy runs when I feel my body needs a reset. So that could be, trail hiking. The beautiful thing about trail running with terrain is you will walk up hills. You just will do it because you don't have much choice. So you can get that really nice low effort, but you get a lot of strength in the legs from trail running. It's different load.
Well, listen, maybe you triathletes have to walk up hills, but us runners, we're on our toes the entire time. All right, that's one of the beauties.
You need it.
I'm not walking up any hills, right? If you put me on Everest, I am wearing spikes, not for the ice, but for the speed. No, I hear that.
You got to get that pace. You got to get that.
That's
right.
Pace, yeah, right. If it's not on Strava as a run, I'm not taking a hike on Strava. I think there's a lot of validity to that. I think. And I do want to be clear for those of you who are joining this primarily as runners, you absolutely should think about switching up the terrain, especially on easy runs, to build the durability. Stepping on different terrain, especially slightly uneven terrain, will build sort of little patterns in your muscles, et cetera. It's not a great way to phrase it, but one of our Endeavor Run trail runner pros, Addie Bracy, talks a lot about how much strength gets built just being on uneven terrain. Jumping off of pavement onto a softer surface for your easy run is not cross training. Okay, it's smart. It's still running. So don't tell yourself you're cross training because you went on a dirt road instead of on asphalt. It's still running. There is some benefit to cross training for sure. There's a tension here though, and jokes aside, Leyla, that I think is maybe it's beyond the scope of our chat tonight, but it's worth us, continuing to explore just ourselves as athletes in this notion of, are you still cross-training or thinking of yourself as a multi-sport practitioner in the service of your running goals because at core you are a runner? Or are you truly shifting your paradigm and actually thinking of yourself as a multi-sport practitioner who may just be okay with preferring running? And I think that's an interesting tension, because I think one of the things that can be difficult for runners, we talk a lot at Endeavor Run about how important it is to try to emulate what the pros do. The pros are generally following the most science, most of them pretty well. And the pros are generally the ones that have the most time to figure this out. So in general, if you can emulate the pros in as many ways as possible, that can fit into your life and your skill set and your natural talent, of course, as an amateur, that's what you want to do. One of the things runners are continuously pounded with is the notion, and there's a good amount of data that backs this up, that the best thing to do to get better at running is run more. Right? Yes, it's great to have your heart rate at 125 beats in general. Obviously, if you're doing it at a point where you're risking injury, you're kind of cresting over that peak and then it's counterproductive. But if you can do it without being injured, it's better to spend that time running than swimming or running than cycling. Like if your goal is to become a better running, every step you take is training part of your brain to make that stride a little bit more efficient, make your body a little bit better at that. And that's why you don't see, for the most part, professional, especially distance runners, cross-training for real fitness gains unless they have to. And there have been great examples of folks in recent years who have taken some time off. And I remember a couple of years ago, prominent middle distance runner, who runs for the pro team that Peter is on the elite squad of. Her name's Colleen. Well, she used to run for Bowerman, Colleen Quigley. She took plenty of time off, spent a lot of time in the pool, and her first race back crushed people. And I feel like she won indoors after a long bout in the pool. And everybody was like, where did this come from? The cardiovascular fitness is there. So how should we think about as runners this notion that all the pros are saying, run more miles, do more running, strength train so you can run, cross train so you can run, fuel so you can run, with this notion of actually you should think about yourself as a multi-sport athlete, and in many ways it'll free you up as a runner. What's your thoughts on that? I don't know if that's
so it's funny. Because I know, a lot of it is elite practices for the everyday athlete, right? I'll sum that up. So we want to look to the elites, but at the end of the day, we're not. If you're not a pro, then you can emulate some of their behaviors, but actually most of the things that we should be emulating isn't necessarily all of their training practices. It's really the foundational things that allow them to do that running. So they can do massive amounts of mileage because they have a support network where they're eating extremely well and provided a lot of support from nutritionists and dietitians to match their calorie requirements. They've got PT support, they've got massage, they've got rehab, prehab. They've got a lot of things that allow them to do that volume of running. Your everyday person who can't afford that much support network and doesn't live in a vacuum, that someone who runs for a living or seeking a pro running sort of life, position, I guess that's working their way there. The rest of us, really, we have to think about how are we could we really emulate that much running and it be, one, healthy, two, actually not go into an overreaching situation where we have, our returns aren't there anymore because it's too hard on the body. And three, do we have the time to commit to all of the things that we have to do to handle that much running? And that's because running is so hard on the body. Whereas swimming and cycling, you get this, you can get a similar amount of fitness from them in terms of aerobic fitness for easier running days without as much load on the body. So it does reduce that need for all the support network. Because you look at any of these pro running teams, if you sneak under the hood, they are really getting worked on a lot for soft tissue work and rehab, prehab constantly. And their nutrition is extremely tight and well monitored. So I do think that whilst we want to emulate the elites in a lot of ways, we actually want to emulate as best we can in real life, having a good foundation. So sleeping well, having reduced stress, having really good habits, that we have a strong foundation before we try and put the house up of really hard work, because it will fall down. And that's the hardest thing, is we have to remember that it's not just the training we want to emulate of the pros, it's actually the whole package of how they're looking after their body so it can handle that stress and recover from that stress and then do it again and again and again and again. So what happens is, if you blindly follow the elites just on their training and not looking at what they're doing to allow their body to adapt from that training, that's where a lot of us, in just everyday people, we're gonna find the body just cannot cope with that amount of running in particular. But even like, I couldn't emulate a pro triathlete. I can't train 30 hours a week. It's impossible, because again, there's genetic component, there's the fact that I don't get paid to train, and then the support network that's in place for them to handle that. So I think you want to look to them and see some really good structural things that we can copy, but then there's a point at which the volume is not probably something that everyday people with jobs and kids and other commitments in their life and not doing it for a living per se. We have to modify and then say, okay, how am I going to do this in a way that best supports my body to have performance adaptation, so I can reach, first and foremost, the best health I can get, because without a foundation of health, the performance will never arrive. Or it might, but it'll be fleeting. So you may get one or two, good performances out of a foundation of something that's not built on health, and then the house will crumble. So I think that's the big thing about looking at the elites, is we want to follow them. Yes, there's some great best practices that come from the pros, but we're not pros. There's some adjustments that we have to make
There's a lot
to,
of wisdom.
yeah.
There's a lot of wisdom there. And I think the thing that, I mean, tell me if this is a reasonable takeaway from what you said, Leyla. If I was going to boil it down into one notion, it's if you want to emulate the pros, you've really got to make sure you're doing all of the stuff. And if you can't do all of this stuff, especially for us runners out there, if you can't do all the other stuff that makes the running part possible, one of the things that you probably need to come off of first is not trimming down on those other things and leaving the running in place, but is actually the overall running volume. But you could substitute that with triathlon type activities, cycling, running, etc. And that's a real way to recognize it. Unless you have the structure around you for that kind of dietary consultation, that kind of soft tissue work in particular, that kind of access to strength training, you know, if you can't go and get the sort of soft tissue work done, especially as frequently as a lot of the pros do, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. So I want to use that and catapult here into, I got a lot of questions for you then. I want to talk a little bit about training, the training components of triathlete that runners can take away in specifics. I want to ask one or two questions about racing, and then I want to ask you one or two questions about sort of the sport of triathlon in general. Of course, if you guys have questions along the way, feel free to chime in on the chat. Some really good thoughts and comments in there already, and we can do a little bit more Q&A at the end if there are. First questions for you about training as a triathlete. The overall volume that you can train without doing damage to your body is higher. And, you know, I know that in general, the cardiovascular system in terms of its reset, especially after a relatively easy effort, can generally fully reset after 12 hours or so. That's the way most people can double and things like that. How do you think about translating pace and heart rate and things like that that you use while running to the bike, to the pool, to the elliptical, to whatever other fancy, expensive equipment you rich triathletes have that none of us have access to? How do you think about that? If my heart rate is 130 at a good pace, give or take 15 beats in either direction, depending on how I'm feeling, my pace is going to range when I'm running on an easy run, just depending on how I'm feeling, 1 mile to the next, 1 day to the next. That's the way it should. Should your pace be really different from one bike ride to the next that's an easy ride? Should your heart rate be? How do you think about translating some of those running metrics we use to track, especially on easy days, to the other sports?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest difference I see in triathlon. I mean, we obviously still use metrics. I mean, triathletes actually love gadgets. So as you mentioned, they tend to have a lot of equipment.
Nice. Must be nice.
No, we all just have to live in caravans so that we can afford all of our triathlon equipment and race entries. No, I mean, it is expensive, but there are, I like to say, there are ways to get into the sport without that. There is that real fancy end of it, but you can actually do a triathlon with some pretty basic entry level stuff and still have a great time and have great performance, because it really is about the engine for the most part, and that's you. So if the engine's strong, it can sort of, no aerodynamic bike will make up completely for a poor engine. So, but yeah, to get to your point, triathlon training, we're definitely using similar metrics to runners. So we will, you know, if there's power meters involved on the bike, we'll be using power similar to a runner who might use stride. Power is a great metric because it's very precise. So heart rate and pace, as you mentioned, are affected by external factors. So heart rate is very variable. It can be a changing target. So it can be a tricky, in terms of looking at it on your watch, and I'll talk about what I mean there. Like, so heart rate's a tricky metric if you just set yourself a zone and off you go. If the temperature changes, if you're a little bit stressed, if you're a little bit tired, depending on your fatigue, your heart rate's going to have some variation. If you're doing short intervals, for instance, running and as a triathlete, there's going to be lag. There's also a thing called cardiac drift that can happen. So the longer you're out there, you can get a drift in that cardiac. So you're now like, am I in the right range? I don't know what's going on. So then you go to pace, but again, pace is impacted by wind, it's impacted by terrain, and it also is impacted by fatigue. So it's not surprising for someone as they're building fatigue in their training periodization and progress, that the pace may start to slip a little bit as that they're carrying that fatigue. So that's still a metrics that we're using. That's why as a coach, as a multi-sport coach with 3 sports and really knowing all those, I like to really train athletes to work with feel. So we use the metrics as a guide, we have a look, we have a think about what we're feeling, but for the most part, we're cross-checking, and we use basically we use the watch doesn't use us. So for most part, in swimming in particular is a great way to learn this. You cannot see what pace you're doing while you're swimming. You see it when you stop.
I beg to differ. If you go as slow as I, you can look at your watch the entire time.
Are you swimming like
all really slow breaths,
oh,
and then every time
okay.
you come through, you just bring the watch right by the eye. That's the way Michael Phelps does it. That's how I do it.
Okay, we need to do a swim camp together then.
Definitely.
So, but anyone that does swim knows that you can feel, it's a feeling sport. And as you progress in swimming, it's really about relaxing and feeling and posture. And I think the same thing applies on the bike. You use the tools to feel effort, but at the end of the day, doing really well in any endurance event, be it a run, be it a triathlon, it's about managing your energy. It's about managing your effort. And so the more balanced, the less variation you can have in your effort in your racing, the better race you will have, because you're not going to sort of burn matches, as we say, and then run out of steam. So when you're training, learning what different efforts feel like, I think is really helpful. And so you want to use, there's lots and lots of metrics that you can use that are comparable to running in triathlon. You're going to use power, going to use pace, going to use heart rate on the bike. But for the most part, I think it's about feeling. So getting into that RPE, relative perceived exertion, using the metrics to guide you, but also listening to your body. And I think because anyone that's doing long events, so that's different for everybody, because long is your own definition of long. But if what you're doing is a lot longer than what you're used to, you've really got to start to learn that effort so that you can develop some pacing and getting good at RPE. So often in the beginning, most athletes need the watches to tell them what's going on. And then over time, you start knowing what's going on, and you check the watch to say, I thought that's what was happening. And you make adjustments so that, for the most part, if you think of the 80-20 model, for the most part, that is actually trying to get athletes to slow down. Right. So, and when I say slow down, that's go slower per se. That's think about the energy and the effort. Is it sustainable for what you're trying to achieve in that session? So triathletes are definitely taking the same principles. So the 80-20 principles, or, that principle of intensity balance, where majority of what you're doing should be fairly steady and moderate and perception easy, but it should feel effortless, repeatable. It should feel good. That's applicable across triathletes as well. Very, very much so. The difference being that that's more applicable to running, in my opinion, than it is, say, to swimming and cycling, because you can push the efforts a little bit more in those two without the impact risks. So you'll see that in swimming, you don't need as much periodization, you don't need as much rest between sessions, because you're reducing the impact on the body. So the stress of the session isn't quite as high as, say, a running session.
When you design your training though, Leyla, like, is it really just about when you have access to the pool and when your body can take running, and you bike all the other days? Like, how do you actually build out a block of, I guess it depends truly how much access you have to different equipment to some extent. And that's, I think, a downside for people getting into triathlon. It's like, I've got to get to a pool. I've got to spend $45,000 on a bike. I need to get like bike shorts that allow me to stay on a bike seat for more than 4 minutes without butt sores. Like, you've got to invest all this money.
You do.
How much of your training is really about what's, for the most of the athletes you train, is really about the optimal way to structure a block of triathlon training? Let's say if they were a pro and had facilities and access, versus like, when can you actually do what? And on the days you can't, you're on the indoor bike training.
No, so there is a pattern to the training. You definitely want to sort of have the same frequency of, so rule of kind of thumb is 3 of each session is good, 2 of each session, depending on if you've got someone that's time crunched. So it's 2, it could be 2 bikes, 2 swims, 2 to 3 runs. And sometimes you can vary that up. By 1 week, it might be 3 bikes. And then next week, it'll be 2 bikes. Like, you can pattern it. So that you get a little bit of a sequence where there's recovery between what you're doing. And really, the biggest thing you're kind of recovering from is the high stress session. So a big long bike session is definitely needs time to recover from it. But most triathletes you'll find who are having to do their big bulk of training in the weekend have to do a long ride on a Saturday and a long run on a Sunday. So how we, most coaches manage that is that long run really isn't as long as you would give to, say, a standalone runner. You're more conservative, and you may do things where you're putting a brick run on the Saturday. So they might be riding on the Saturday, they'll do a short run off the bike, and then they'll do a shorter run on the Sunday, because we've started to play around with how we're getting the fitness without overloading the person, because there's not much recovery there. And that's a lot of training in 2 days. Then Monday is definitely going to be strength and swim or a recovery day. It's pretty standard. Kind of most people who have a weekend, their Mondays are going to be very light because they're going to need that full day to recover. And then Tuesday, you're starting maybe something a little spicy, not much volume, but a little bit of spice in there with some short interval running or just some strides, something to get the body back after that long weekend. And that sort of, then you just take the pattern from there. And then you're just looking, each individual athlete is going to be able to handle a different sort of sequence. So it's very much like an experiment of one for everybody. There's principles. Everybody's unique. And I think once you start really listening to how your body responds to training, and if you notice every Monday, if you go and do it and it's terrible, then stop doing it. like actually take recovery day, or make that day something that's very therapeutic and refreshing. It could be a walk, it could be a very easy swim that's not, super, it's got some drills and form. And if you notice that Tuesday, you feel good again, you're able to execute that particular workout. Now you're starting to find pattern. So I do think that that's something that every athlete needs to explore, be it a runner, be it a multi-sport athlete, is how long does my body take? Because you're unique, everybody's unique. And some people can turn around and just run again on Monday and they're good to go. And other people are like, no, I need a little bit longer. So
let me throw this at you. I had a friend who was a big time marathoner, and after after an injury, got really out of shape, wanted to get back into it. And he decided to take this multi-sport approach. And his thinking was, because there's a lot less stress on your body when swimming and biking, he could do a lot more hard workouts if he made all of his hard workouts swim and bike, and all of his runs were just easy runs. Now, obviously, that's not optimal for triathlon training, but in terms of like, if you want to do 4, Tabata rides and intense swims over the course of a week, and then 2 or 3 days of easy jogging, would you recommend that just as a fitness model? Not obviously as a training for triathlon model.
Yes, here's the difference. There's exercising and then there's training. So if you're training for something it's specific, that may not be the smartest model for specificity for a particular race. But when you're just trying to build fitness, and it's, I always say random training gets random results, and you might be surprised. Sometimes those random results are interesting when you're like, I got really fit from doing that. Right. But it wasn't necessarily planned, and it wasn't necessarily something you were in control of. You were just going, I'm going to try this out. And I do think that the thing that you set that, that friend of yours up well and explained is, when you've had a big long break, you just need to build back that consistency.
It's just fitness at that point.
Yes, it's just coming back, doing what feels good, building consistency, and letting the mind get back into it. And then somewhere in there, normally like, you know what? I want to go see how I do.
So that could be a cool way for those who are interested in exploring, sort of thinking about themselves, not just as runners who cross train on the bike or in the pool, but as multi-sport athletes, especially when coming back from an injury, is potentially an interesting time to experiment, because you have a little bit more flexibility to really vary those up if your real goal is just to rebuild baseline fitness so that you can be in a position to train for something specific. So that's pretty interesting. I want to ask you 1 or 2 questions, Leyla, about racing as a triathlete and what us as runners can think about that. What are the 1 or 2 things that you think triathletes approach races differently than runners around? Are there one or two things in particular, either with the way they attack the races in general, the way they think about getting into a race in the morning? What are one or two big things that differentiate triathletes when it comes to, thinking about or executing races than runners?
I would say that the big standout things is possibly nutrition. I noticed that runners are a lot more, and there's probably some really good reasons for this, from the GI distress, the calorie requirement is less, but definitely triathletes have a stronger focus on what they eat before the day starts and the way they plan for eating on the bike, calorie intake, hydration, and it's a lot more. Like, I think triathletes try and consume as much as they can. Whereas, and this is again my impression, is runners tend to try and do as much as they can on as little as they can. And I think some of that does stem not necessarily from it being a great idea, because I think some runners really start to nail their nutrition. But I think it becomes from, there's just so much tendency for GI distress when running. And that's absolutely true even for triathletes. So if you've ever watched a triathlon or the world champs, and if you ever see the amateur end of it, you'll see a lot of people not looking too well because that's where the GI distress can happen. But I do think that triathletes maybe put a little bit more, well, I notice when I go with runners, I'm the one with the big hydration pack on and all my snacks, and I go running and they've got nothing. And I'm like, we're running for 2 hours and they've got nothing. And I'm always like, okay, that's different. Now I don't have an exact opinion on that. I personally am a big fan of not training like, I always have hydration and nutrition on me when I train, because my personal experience, and this is again that experiment of one, but there are some rules of thumb that everybody should explore, is my recovery is greatly impacted if I train in a depleted state. So I'm fine for the workout. I can go do the workout depleted and I'll actually execute it, and I've tried this, but I am completely dead the rest of that day, almost a bit spacey. I feel very fatigued. I usually end up drooling on the couch at some point. Then I'm starving that night, craving sugar and salt, and I just can't seem to satisfy. And then, as opposed to when I do training and keep hydrated and eating during the session, I don't tend to feel that. So a little bit of, like, I think difference with triathletes is I think we maybe have a little bit stronger focus on how much we're eating, because we arrive at our marathons and half marathons, for if we're talking 70.3 and marathon, we arrive there depleted. It's really hard to arrive there fully stocked, as opposed to when you arrive on the morning of a half marathon or a marathon, you can be pretty stocked up from your you're ready, you're full. And you've got that solid 90 minutes, if not longer, before you're going to be starting to run short, as that glycogen starts to burn off, depending on what pace you're running at. Whereas triathletes, we're trying to minimize that to arrive less worse off, I guess I would say.
And I would say there's growing emphasis, right, in running too, and there's some recent evidence that people should probably top up their glycogen stores more frequently than they historically thought. I mean, if you think about the marathoners, it was make as few stops as possible, leave as little of the chance as possible, try to ride that wave until you're about to crash and then fill up, like that episode of Seinfeld where Kramer tries to take the car as far as it will go while the needle's on zero.
That's my favorite episode.
Of course it would be. Yeah.
I love
it. The way they're thinking about it now is more like you want to treat it like your gas tank in the winter, which is like, yeah, you can let it get down there, but for the optimal engine performance, you want to have at least a quarter tank of gas at all times. And so you're seeing now a lot more athletes, especially pro marathoners, taking gels every 20 to 25 minutes, as opposed to waiting till halfway through or something like that. So I think this notion of fueling is really important, that triathletes do a really nice job with, that runners could learn from. And I really love that idea of fueling not just to execute the workout, which is often how runners think about it, but fueling to enable you to have a better recovery or to have less sugar cravings later in the day. That's really something to think about if you find yourself able to get through those workouts okay, but later on feeling like, wow, like I need to go and have like 5 orders of Cinesticks to get through the evening. and you don't want to do that. If you want to do that, awesome, you should go do it. If you don't want to go do that, think about maybe you're fueling before and even during the running, not just what you top yourself off with afterwards, which is pretty cool. Now, is that why we see, I've seen at triathlon races, this is a quick question for you. What's up with the triathletes walking through the aid stations at the pro level? Where does that come from?
So so that's and this is a technique that I think, you're not going to see in elite runners, don't get me wrong, but everyday runners, this is a strategy that can be very helpful for a successful run, for a variety of reasons. It's not something everybody will use, but when we arrive to the run, we are pretty fatigued. Especially, I'll use an Ironman as an example. So you're about to run a marathon, and an average age grouper may take 7 hours for the bike, let's say over an hour. So you're 8.5, near on 9 hours into being at aerobic effort. That's a long time. So now you're going to run a marathon, and the heart rate needs to come up now at this point. So you want to make sure you can do that, because the heart rate will be lower for the swimming, and it should technically be lower for the swimming and biking, and then it's going to hopefully come up a little bit as you run. If you're not fueled properly, you're not going to be able to do that, because the body just will not respond. But the other thing that happens is you're very fatigued. You're physically fatigued from a muscular standpoint, like movement patterning. Your body just doesn't want to it's been moving for too long. So what a lot of triathletes implement is breaking it into aid station by aid station. So you run a fairly good pace, steady, and then you walk the aid station, let that heart rate drop a little bit, reset the form, and then run again. And it delays fatigue. It can allow that heart rate to not get where you either struggling to keep it up, or it's just getting too high and not sustainable, like just where you're feeling off. So it breaks it into patterning and those walk breaks allow you to get your nutrition in as well. So back half, you want to use this strategy where you're not walking because you have to, you're walking because you're planned to. So it's a strategy.
At least tell people that when you're walking because you have to. You just start yelling to people on the sidelines. It's a strategy, people. It's a strategy.
I have done this as an experiment, because I usually don't tell people to do anything I'm not willing to do myself. So I actually had an injury in a build up to a race, and didn't feel like I was super confident with my running. So that can happen a lot with people where you're like, I'm not sure where I'm at. It's really hard to know how to pace. So this is a great strategy actually when you're going into a race a little bit like that, because you're like, what I'm going to do? I'm going to just, and this is a brisk walk. It's not like like you're walking, but you're drinking and taking stuff in, and then you're like, go. And what it is mentally is breaking in, they're usually about a mile apart. Some run races are different. And then you just focus on getting my aid station, but that very short break can actually allow you to hold a very steady effort that provides you a really good average pace. So I often show people my graph from walking, and I walked every aid station to prove this model so I came out of transition and walked the first aid station. People just like, whoa, she's going to have a bad day. I remember one young girl telling me, you're nearly there. I was like, I'm 1 mile into a marathon in an Ironman. I'm not nearly there, but I knew what I was doing. I was like, okay, I'm good. And I walked every aid station, and that was actually my Kona qualifying race. And
this can take me back about 20 years to a book I read a long time ago. I do think, and somebody should correct me if you guys know this better than I do, I want to say it was Bill Rogers, who used the American marathoner, who used to advocate for walking every couple miles for 30 seconds to drop your heart rate. And I don't know if he would do it. Certainly the elites today, it's just inefficient. It might have been Galloway. I can't remember. But
there's been a couple of pros, if I remember. I'm trying to think who it was. It might have been Frodeno, actually, or it could have been, I think it was Frodeno. The first time he won the world champs, he walked every aid station at Kona. But if you watch this, it's not a walk like you think. If you watched it, it's a strategic effort to slightly reduce the pace and take in nutrition. So it doesn't look like a death march, as I would call some people's walk, and now I'll put my hands up on that happening to me as well. But because I like to experiment everything, by the way. But like I've certainly had a few races that I've had to walk because, and I would, my first Ironman went like that, where I was like, I have no idea how people run this whole thing. Like I wanted to go hide in the Portaloo because that was a better option than staying out on the road. And if you've ever been at a Portaloo at a race, you know that that's not a good option at all.
Known as the porta potty for those of you.
Oh, porta potty. I'm sorry, Portaloo.
Yes.
So
yes.
That's one thing. I mean, it's not. Now, I think it's just not something that you want to discredit. It's something as you get close to the race, it's an option. And so I always say, don't set yourself rigid things like I'm not going to walk in this race. Like that's crazy. Look at your training. Think about how your body has handled the load. Look at where you've got to with your training. And if that could provide you a better way to manage the distance and keep the stress down and maintain better clean effort, try it out. And it can be very surprising, but it's got to be on your terms. Like you can't be forced to do something like that. You've got to be like, this sounds like a strategy that will make this really enjoyable for me. So that's something where pros do it. Not many of them, but some of them have had success with it. If you look at any triathlon, most pros at some point will be walking some of the aid stations. And if you watched a full video of all the pros running at Kona, they're all walked at some point. Sure. in that run, because it's really hot and it's really hard, and they know that the effort they're at is not sustainable. So they're going to do something to moderate that effort. Now, in a marathon, half marathon, you're probably not going to see this as much because the level of fatigue isn't as high. But like I said, if you arrive at your race and your life has got busy, your training didn't go perfect, but you still want to go have a great day, this can be a really good way to keep that heart rate under control, keep your form, and give you a nice, steady, well-paced race. And you could be surprised with the outcome. So it's a strategy. It's worth thinking about, and I think it's something you don't have to use, but I think sometimes when you have it as an option, it can feel good to say, that's how I'm going to go today. If I, and I'm going to do this strategy early. And what I like is if you get halfway through, say it's a marathon, and you get halfway through or even further than halfway through, and you're feeling really good, you don't need to keep walking. Like just, because you protected the first half of the race, which is really what gets you through the second half. And most people overdo front end pacing. So walking early can help you, avoid that overdoing the front of a run.
Very cool. Yeah, that's really neat. I'm mindful of the time as well. I know we're about at the hour. We can go a few minutes more if it's okay with you, Leyla, and others who can stick around. I will say, I want to ask you a question about the sport. I will say, having kind of dabbled in triathlon and returning from an injury myself not too long ago, one of the things that I was really interested about in the sport was how competitors sort of perceive the various events and distances. Because, running, you generally have two variables when it comes to a race for the most part. I mean, yes, trail and surface maybe, but it's generally where's the race taking place? So what's the temperature going to be? Right. And the other one is it hilly or not? And those are both true for the running portion of triathlon, but you also have, is the swim in a pool, or is it in a pond, or is it in the ocean, and is there a current? Or is the bike on hills, but the run on flats, right? How big are the transition area, right? You have all these other variables to play with and jigger as you think about it. The one that I really didn't expect was that, at least in common parlance, I know the Ironman brand has certain specifications, but in common parlance, it's my understanding, Leyla, that what it means for a sprint triathlon, there's not a uniform sprint distance, right? There's a lot of sprint distance triathlons where the bike is 20 miles, but this one's only 14 miles. And there's some real differences around those things. Whereas if you're in a 5K, it's 5 kilometers, it's 3.1 miles, right? It's going to be the same every time. So that's something that's cool. One of the questions that I had about the sport is, I see a lot of runners when they get into running, especially if they get into it later in life, have this sort of progression of how they think about running race distances, where at first it's, oh my goodness, how could I ever complete a 5K or a 10K? And then they get to a point where running's more of a part of their identity, and they maybe are doing training runs at slower pace that are that long, and what seemed like a long run is not that long anymore. And they realize, like, all right, like the real holy grail is the marathon. And then you have those running folks who have been there for a while and realize, like, sure, that's true. But training for a 5K to PR in that is really, really hard also. Like to run the shorter distances really fast and train a lot for that, for the folks who are really into running and have gotten over the like it's the marathon or nothing thing is really cool. Is that true with the Ironman distances as well in triathlon? Is it people get into it as a sprint to see if they can complete it, and then it's like I've got to do the half or the full Ironman, but then later they're like, actually, to like go really hard at sprint triathlon is really cool, and is there a similar progression in terms of the thought about the sport, or am I projecting?
No, I think it's exactly the same. I think the thing, Ironman do a really great job of marketing the 70.3 and the Ironman. So, I mean, they do a wonderful job. So if you get into triathlon, you're very quickly like, oh, I want that red carpet experience, right? I want like the feels of that distance. So I do think people do go on that track of, and sometimes they skip a step. So I've seen people not do a sprint and go straight to a 70.3 and then straight to an Ironman. I've seen people do not, their first triathlon is an Ironman. So there's lots of different, I've seen lots of different ways in. But I do think over time, you tend to learn your own physiology. So some people will dabble with the longer distance and they're like, it's not for me. I mean, I love the short distance. I love fast. That person's very got a natural tendency for the faster paces, and the excitement and the speed and the transition process of a sprint is very, very intense, very high octane people. And then you've got some people who just really much prefer the effort and the strategy that goes into the longer races. So, and 7.3 is quite enjoyable because it does fall somewhere in the middle. It's, you're not super slow, but you're not,
Speak for yourself, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, but it is an event that you can kind of get into some effort, but you're not going at like that really fast effort. But Ironman is a lot for most people to actually take on the commitment of the training that's required for it is the longest one-day event, multi-sport one-day event. And it's just a big commitment. And as you mentioned a couple of times, it is still a relatively expensive sport. There are barriers to breaking that down that will continue to come, but the sport itself is very dominated by one brand. And
if your neighbor has a pool and they're not up until 7 a.m., that's how you get over that hurdle. If your neighbor has a bike and they're not home until 5 p.m., that's how you get over. Right? There's a lot of ways. What you're saying is there's a lot of ways to get around some of those expense barriers, is what I hear you saying.
There are some ways around, but I would admit that the initial upfront cost to get into the sport. But I'd also say, what are you willing to pay for something that makes you happy and is your hobby and is your social outlet and that makes you a healthy human being? And if you weigh that cost up and it's important to you, you'll find that, there's ways to find secondhand bikes, to find places to train that are affordable. I think if it's important, there is a way, but I'm not going to deny that there's still some barriers to triathlon being expensive.
It's a good point though. I mean, when I got into it, there's a refurbished bike store. I got a really nice bike that had sat in someone's garage that they put it back in the shop, and it was, $450 for a bike that probably would have been worth a lot more. One of the things that was nice coming from running to that sport was, in running, there's not a huge cost difference between good enough equipment and the best equipment, right? You're talking about like good enough equipment, running shoes, $100, the best $220, especially with our Endeavor on disc, right? Like that's a lot of money. Don't get me wrong, but like a good enough bike for someone who's getting into triathlon is $400. The best bike is $35,000, right? So the scale of difference between what you can get to get going and the best, you don't feel like, all right, well, if I'm not going to, it's the best or nothing, you're not going to afford the best, and you don't need to afford the best right away. So there was something kind of nice about transitioning.
Yeah, I do think I agree with you on the longer distant races, because there's so much equipment that's aerodynamic and can support your performance, that does play a factor in making those big performance jumps. So if you've got big lofty goals of doing a world championship qualifier or getting in, there's a little bit there where because so much expensive equipment is allowed in triathlon, it does make it a bit tricky. And I think most people in the sport are aware of that. and we continue to try and find ways to make it more accessible to more people. There's lots of great programs out there. I actually sit on the board of one here in Charlotte called Try It for Life. Yeah, Coach B just put his hand up. There's lots
I'm on the board here. Excuse me.
Well, it's not. It's a voluntary board. Like I don't get paid.
She's unfazable, folks. I'm doing everything I can here to try to rile her out. She's unfazable. It's all those hours sitting on the stationary bike, getting to know her own mind. You just can't psych her out. It's unbelievable. No, it's really cool. Really cool.
But yeah, so I mean, I personally, I've triathlon. I ran, just to give you the quick background for you, but I mean, I ran, in my younger years, I did like triathlons. I'd never done a marathon, but did a lot of running, a lot of other sports, lots and lots of sports. Grew up a swimmer, discovered triathlon later in life. And, my first one was like many people's. I was on a pretty shonky mountain bike. I was wearing borrowed equipment, but it was just an immediate sense of achievement that I felt when I crossed. There was a sprint and I was just like, I think I've found my thing. And from there, it took a while to build the equipment up and to get there and find ways to, and relying on a lot of community support and people giving you advice, so that you don't make those expensive purchases that aren't necessary, because it's really worth navigating all of that equipment. But at the end of the day, really what it comes down to is consistent training, enjoying what you're doing, having fun, staying healthy, and setting yourself really good goals that motivate you and just excite you, and just keep seeking performance, keep trying to, I have a saying, it's like your best self through sport. So you're constantly trying to evolve yourself, to discover things. And triathlon, running, any endurance sport, to be honest, is an opportunity to really better yourself as a human being. It sort of transcends. A lot of people are like, oh, what do you do? What do you think about? And just out there for hours. I mean, even when I go running, they say the same thing, and I'm like, everything and nothing, and it's the most beautiful experience because it just lets you be with yourself, really appreciate your body, appreciate what you can do. And I don't know anyone that doesn't come back from a run or a swim or a bike and doesn't feel better. So
it's a good note for us to end on, in the fact that your future self is almost always happy with your past self for just getting out there. Is the way my wife likes to put it, which I like a lot. Leyla, this is super great. I think everyone here would probably agree with me in saying that I think it's justified that I put you in the pantheon of cool people I know, despite only knowing you for a couple months. Where can people reach you? As I promise I'd play us out with some Aussie tunes. I will do that in the background here. My number one pump up song of the past few, top 3 all time, number 1 for me the past couple of years. While I put it on, tell us how folks can find you and reach you. I know you're not big on social media. If folks have questions, if they want to get more into this stuff, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm too busy training. Oh yeah. Which my husband thinks this is an American band. It's a point of argument for us all the time, but yes, Akadaka. So you can find me, obviously, a director of training, 80/20 Endurance. So you can find me through results at 8020endurance.com. Go and have a look at what we've got to offer. And then, of course, I have my own coaching business, Flow Multi-Sport Coaching. And I do post occasionally on social media when I'm not training or I've got something fun to share.
What are your handles for those that want to follow you on social?
So it's Flow Multi-Sport Coaching is one, or at the Tri Chick. So
at the Tri Chick.
At the Tri Chick. I've had that one for a long time.
That's pretty good.
Not giving it up.
This is great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who joined. Those of you who are watching and recording, thanks so much for joining in and listening as well. I hope you found it useful. I know some of you will be seeing upcoming at the Endeavor Run running retreat in Austin in just a couple of weeks. Very excited, especially because it looks like the Omicron wave should really be dying down and following the patterns we expected in the next couple of weeks. And obviously everyone's required to be vaccinated and boosted, and we're going to make sure everyone always does things like that as safely as possible. If you're still interested in coming to that event in the next couple of weeks, let us know. We still do have 1 or 2 partial scholarships available We've been really happy in how much money we've been able to give out to help folks come and attend this, make it part of their lives. So don't let that stop you from at least asking. But check that out at endeavorrun.com. Leyla, thank you. You're the bomb. Thank
You're
you
welcome.
all for joining. Be safe out there, and
Keep training.
keep training. I like that. I was going to make fun of triathlete, but you did it good. Take care, everyone.
Take care,
Right,
team.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.